Well, I'm here with Craig Stewart, who joins me again. We recently had a discussion about a year ago or so now. Feels like forever ago with all the things that have happened in 2020. But he joins me from Canada. He's a fellow student of the work of Rene Girard in Mimetic theory. He's working on some new project that will be coming out here soon, hopefully. So, Craig, thanks for joining me.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks, David.
Very good. Well, we've got a lot to catch up on, but I always appreciate your insights. You always help explain things from different angles, using some of the same common toolkit that we borrow from with the anthropological work that we both enjoy. And it's one of those things that it's almost like an endless treasure trove of things that you can dive into, right?
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I just I was rereading Things Hidden again just last week, and even there, I'm still scraping out new gold and integrating it in new ways every time I go back. Girard just inexhaustible treasures.
And it's really the Bible that and the gospel that's really the treasure trove that Girard's helping us kind of mine a little bit there. We have to give credit to Jesus.
Well, and Girard does too. He says my discovery could only be really a rediscovery, right? And could only actually be made possible under the reign of the gospel. If the gospel hadn't already intruded and did it and done its work, then Mimetic theory wouldn't even be possible in the first place. So Girard makes his proper obeisance to the gospel, and I'll certainly, of course, make it too. But I would also want to stress the genuinely new thing that's in there, which is Girard's discovery of mimetic desire and the that falls out as a result of it.
Right.
And none of that, which is really penetrated into mainstream psychology or how we think about all these kinds of philosophical anthropology, psychology, all the domains in which we haven't even properly resituated the domains and what they would look like under the aegis of this new theoretical framework.
Well, and we're just at the beginning, and so it feels like it's the beginning of a big, rich mine of information and theoretical knowledge that both of us want to kind of popularize and extend and critique and refine and build from. And that's great. It's not about what Girard's done. It's not really just about, an individual. It's about a whole field of knowledge that's opened up that we can use the Bible as a toolkit and other disciplines to try to integrate a more cohesive and more clear understanding of the social sciences. And I would suggest possibly a link to, the hard sciences as well, but that's a little scary. So.
It is. Well, it's a little scary if we believe that that train hasn't already been mapped out really well. And in some of the intermediate areas, I think at least the description and the train is mapped out pretty well. Like if you go from higher levels of physics into chemistry, that area seems to be
chemistry is doing a lot better than physics.
Yeah, very, very good. Yeah. But biology, how we're actually going to integrate thinking about epistemology and information and psychology into biology, we don't have a clue there. Biology thinks it knows itself really well, but in actual fact, if you go and press it on a number of really interesting points, it really doesn't have much to offer in terms of explanation. And like you were hinting at just before we got started here, physics too, and areas of physics like astrophysics that we might think are well settled and certain are I think very much shown to be up for paradigm shifts. So,
well, just yesterday on my radio program, I was doing a discussion about the idea that how to do science like Jesus, and the average person would sit there and say, "Oh my goodness, you're such a joke." But the point is really, it's the idea that, think about it for a second, that if you don't have the epistemological suspicion of institutions of knowledge, then maybe you need to imitate Jesus to learn how to be more skeptical of rarefied sacred cows along and around your culture, right? And so if you imitate the attitude of Jesus and his ability to violate those sacred boundaries of this is the way the world is, like he does in his time, if we really imbibe that same spirit and then use that with discernment, not that we accept any wild, wacky alternative to something, of course not, but precisely the opposite. It's that we realize that so many of the things that are considered settled science and dogmatic stuff, if you look at it, it's really based on an adoration of genius minds that's more social science mediation rather than actual data-driven conclusions. So such that when you say, well, we know it's a monocharged particles exist. It's like, well, maybe that's a baked-in assumption that you baked into the pie, and you were afraid to challenge, as Thomas Kuhn would say, you were afraid to go in there and rip apart the very foundations of the paradigm that you've inherited, precisely because these guilds in academia require a kind of strict adherence to the reigning hierarchies to be able to have a job.
Well, for sure.
There's a sacred to science, right?
Oh, and we know that. I mean, it's not really well articulated or understood why, but Thomas Kuhn or any of the sociologists or the philosophers of science can point their finger at structures that are at work that have nothing to do with what we consider to be the bedrock empirical rules of doing science, as much as that's a horrible phrase and gets abused in all kinds of ways. But I think also too a major deficit has been the fact that because everything has become so specialized and so narrow and so narrowly siloed, and then those narrow silos form a whole institutional bedrock and group structure in their own, which is, I think that leads to all the problems of groupthink that we're kind of just gesturing at. But there's been a loss of training in terms of a general sort of mind. Like, the great physicists who preceded us in the 20th century and in the 19th century understood the philosophical implications of their discoveries, and they were philosophers as well, in the best sense of the term, as lovers of wisdom, who kind of were polymaths and had a broad range of knowledge from which they can draw upon. And now you have physicists today who can't do philosophy, and I think that shows up as a major problem when you're trying to put theories together, because a lot of what philosophy can tell you to do is kind of act as a bullshit detector to show you when your theoretical outlook isn't coming together as it should, or where the problems might be, instead of just going off and down all these kinds of rabbit holes that are reinforced by groupthink and whatever happens to be popular at the time.
Yeah, I think Sabina Hassenfelder, she's a theoretical physicist. She has a book out called Lost in Math, which really looks at how, the theoretical physics community became lost in looking for elegance in mathematical equations. And I would just push that further and just say, yeah, I mean, the whole assumption, and this is very audacious for people to, of course, physicists are going to be mad, but the whole assumption that show me your equations before you show me the physical world, I find completely erroneous. You know what I mean?
It's outside of the tradition of science as it is
exactly,
in as we've inherited from the Enlightenment. It's outside of empiricism. And I mean, I'm not a mathematician, but a mathematician will tell you that you can end up reconciling and proving all kinds of things in mathematics that have no bearing on reality whatsoever. Right. So yeah, I think that's a good criticism.
So my point is simply that I think here, I'm just going to lay out this premise, and then you can go off and we'll go somewhere.
Sure, we'll riff away. Let's do it.
So the idea, I think that, that the problem we have is that we're stuck in this kind of stagnating, zero-sum pressure cooker atmosphere in the West. And we believe that we've discovered all the big questions of history, and we've really discovered most of the big scientific things. And now we're just kind of tinkering around these weird things like the Higgs boson or whatever. And so we're going after these little weird things, and we don't really have anything that helps the common man. As Peter Thiel says, we declared war on cancer in the 1960s, and we still haven't won. We've got a lot of body count, a large body count, not a lot of victories going on. And so the question is, there's something fundamentally wrong with this whole thing. Now, my one theory, there's a lot of layers to what I could say to criticize, to provide an answer. But one part is that I think we don't know what an atom is. And we don't know what an atom is precisely because what I call the Mowgli effect, which is a riff from the Jungle Book, with the idea of, you discovered the fire and the whole kingdom submits to you now because you can master the fire. And I think that's what happened in the field of physics with the atomic bomb. It was almost like the human species said, okay, you're the gods now because you just created a fire that can literally destroy the whole world over. You're the gods. You're the high priests of the gods of our time. And so we're going to just like encase you in this rarefied, like enclosed box, because whatever you guys did, you figured out how to drop a bomb that can blow up whole cities and potentially the whole world. And therefore, we're just going to kind of put you in a rarefied position in the hierarchy of scientific knowledge. And then because of the presence of government funding most of scientific research, of course, it's easy for a sacrificial mechanism like the state to keep bad ideas entrenched longer than the natural Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift cycle would happen. You see what I mean? If enough anomalies pile up, Kuhn would say, eventually the paradigm is just overthrown like a revolutionary overthrow in politics. But my argument is that because everything's so entrenched with the level of bureaucratic, labyrinthine, central bank-backed government control of research funding and universities and peer review papers and the whole subsidies and the whole package from federal, state, and local, that it monopolizes and it protects through violence these old, outdated ideas that have basically been kind of baked into the cake based on some empirical research. But really, the foundations and theoretical ideas need to be overthrown, but they can't, precisely because of the monopolization of scientific knowledge that the state has provided. So we're in a situation, this is what I'm trying to get at, is that we can find cures for cancer, we can find energy too cheap to meter, we can have anti-gravity flying devices, but it's going to take a real Christian courageous move of very smart young individuals and women, men and women, coming together and really having the courage to tell the emperor that it has no clothes and to demonstrate it publicly with energy too cheap to meter in public demonstrations with, I'm talking, amazing types of energy design, ideas, cures for cancer that are right under our noses. Those are the kind of things that we need to see, because my whole premise is, look, politics is not going to save us. And the aesthetic of Christianity is beautiful. But I think at some point, when you have a society that's so lost, the only way you can kind of revivify an attraction towards the message of Christ is to do what Christ does, which is to perform miracles.
Well, I mean, that might be too imminent for me, but
imminent.
I think
what do you mean imminent?
Well, that might be too imminent. That's too much imminentizing the eschaton. I don't know. I like my miracles to be transubstantiation and healings of the supernatural variety. But by all means, scientific miracles as well. Let's do it. And go
I think
it.
The purpose of Christianity is scientific development.
No, definitely not. We'll come back. I think we'll run away from the hard physics and run back over to the anthropological and the philosophical and the social scientific. But I think the first question, the optimistic answer to the first bit of that, I think, would be is, maybe we're actually in that revolutionary moment right now. Maybe we're in the midst of seeing all of these old paradigms toppling over because the emperor has no clothes and their foundations have been exposed. So much of what's been propagated as gospel in terms of mainstream science that everyone needs to get on board with in terms of, say, global warming, or in terms of what we've recently gone through in terms of this pandemic, is just, the scientific credibility of both of these huge scientific inflations, if you want, is absolutely nil when put under a microscope. So that's one area. But then I think also institutionally, the danger, I think, in going the way that you should do is to scapegoat the institutional structure itself as a bad thing. And I think that any institution is going to need to have both gates and walls. And if the gates and walls are protecting an old paradigm that can't answer the questions and innovate and be fruitful and productive as it used to be, then that's a problem. But that eventually, if you raise up a competing institution that does have the new good stuff, that ultimately it will carry the day in the long run. So I don't think it's in the institutional structure itself that's the problem. Another piece might be the fact that there's gigantic corruption and huge inefficiencies laid out all over the society as a result of having been organized for growth that is no longer taking place, right? Our populations are shrinking rather than growing. America is kind of an exception, but overall in the West, this is a general thing. We're not our populations are no longer fruitful. They can't be organized according to consumption-led growth anymore. And so when we're creating all of these universities with garbage degrees that are going out, it seems like it's actually just a whole bunch of scams that are taking place. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that universities and institutions are useless. It just happens to be a present moment in which we're in right now, but could easily be otherwise. And I think we're actually in a major moment of change and reorganization, and this is just what it looks like to live through it and to watch it all taking place.
So you like the fourth turning idea?
Well, I know fourth turning by
it is that Steve Bannon promotes that.
Oh, okay, yes, no, this is the Hegelian generational dynamics. No, I don't. I'm not one of those.
But it's convenient that it's right on time with their little model.
It's true.
It's pretty cute, right? It's pretty neat.
It is, and maybe it's just my inability to draw the star charts of when the generations start and end correctly that causes me to be wrong in apprehending it. But no, I mean, I think it's a wildly Hegelian deterministic theory that I don't think is actually really makes any sense when you drill down into the theoretical mechanics of it.
So,
but we might very well it might be accidentally correct, right? Like this is that's entirely possible.
So one of the things that I think kind of helps help us find our feet here is that the idea that where are we going? Does history have a purpose? Does history have a direction? Is it going somewhere? And I have kind of more of an optimistic eschatology than, say, Rene Girard, because I do believe that Jesus is going to save the world, that he came to save the world and he will save the world. And I believe, like Habakkuk, that the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth as the sea is wet. And I believe these things. I believe the Old Testament prophecies about things, the Mount Zion, and everybody's going to come here. And I believe that what Jesus is going to accomplish will work, and that he will succeed, and that how that looks is kind of radically up to us, and us being his body, being his mimetic, body on earth.
I mean, the Gospels were pessimistic, right? Girard was pessimistic, but the Gospels ultimately predicted the failure of Christianity in the end. Well, not in the end, because in the end, of course, it's as optimistic as it could possibly be, but that the gospel message itself would fail in history is ultimately what the Gospels, I think, predict. And on the other hand, right, you can quote other passages and sources that can lead you in another direction. Where Girard settled on, which I think is the happy place to settle on, is that it's up to us. It's not determined in advance whether or not this succeeds or fails. It's the power of human freedom and the power of human agency and the power of cooperation of grace that ultimately will determine how it is, how prolonged this period of transition between Revelation and Apocalypse and final Apocalypse takes place. So no, I think it's messier than that, in that.
No, I'm saying the same thing. I'm not saying it's going to be, it's not going up and up and up in a good way like that. It's more like these radical swirly cues that are going to go up and down real low. And so we may be in the beginning of a really long downward slope that could last 100 years or longer.
Well,
and so we don't know what it looks like because we don't have that godlike perspective of the
also,
full sweep of history.
That's right, and if we think also just from kind of theoretical first principles, we can see that once the old sacred has kind of been leveled out, brought down to earth, and remodified according to ways that we would find amenable to our modern understanding of humanity, things get both better and worse both at the same time, right? You have all of the take something like social justice, right? You have all the good kinds of social justice where we actually care about the poor, the marginalized, the persecuted, the rejected, and then you have this horrible anti-Christian parody of social justice that is just acting as a parasite on concern for victims, a parody of Christianity that right now is lost in attempting some kind of quasi-Maoist insurrection at the moment across the United States, based on carving people up into little identity groups, pitted in rivalry against one another, and claiming oppression and trying to distribute the share of the oppression pie to all of these different
but
people.
Sometimes I measure.
It's both simultaneously, right?
Yeah. But sometimes I measure the success of the gospel precisely because I measure it by the satanic parody imitation of it. Like, man, Satan's got to go that far now to make it. It's almost like wow, that shows me what's really going on underneath the subtle logos that's always expelled. Wow, Satan's got to pull out this level of victim concern now to keep the whole charade going. Like, a few hundred years ago, he didn't have to do this kind of level. It was just traditional scapegoat type classical mechanisms as far as, when we look back at it. But you look at it now, you're like, man, Satan's really got to pull out all the stops to try to imitate the Lamb of God, even at this level of degree. You know what I mean? So I see that as a kind of as an encouraging thing.
No, I think that's an extremely sharp and wise insight, and you can almost see writ the hand of providence on the failures of this kind of anti-Christian parody of imitation, in that it just completely undermines itself, and in so doing only ends up furthering the ends of the gospel. Right,
which is so wonderful. I feel like I can see. I mean, I hate to be a Christian triumphalist, but I really see.
No, it's okay. I won't push too hard back on any Christian triumphalism.
We don't get enough of it around, and I don't mind. Okay. But it's like I look at that and I'm like, I think a good Girardian would see a very optimistic thing here taking place. Because, for example, I mean, it's something that I've been telling you, that the state is this vestige of the sacred. Now, you think I'm scapegoating it. I'm not.
I love
the state. I love the state.
Okay, we got to record and clip that and just say David Gornoski saying, I love the state.
Because I was told by Jesus to love your enemies. You got to love everybody. Right?
No, I mean, really, I do.
And they're not even my enemies. Okay.
No, because you're a member of it too, right? You're a member of the state. You're a member of the state as well.
And I don't have my card. I don't have my Sam's card for it.
Well, no, and critique is fine. But Jesus, he's. What you were saying in terms of how do we imitate Jesus doing science, and the same thing becomes true. Like thinking through in the imitation of Christ in all of these different domains is a real work that needs to be redone in the light of everything that we've learned in terms of mimetic anthropology. And one of those areas is where I think you're trying to work out through is, what does political engagement look like, and how does this all work? And Christ leaves these things open in such a broad way, where he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's, thereby divorcing the sacred from Caesar. Caesar is no longer just this the old sacred avatar of violence that rules over, and everything gets all confused and mixed up together. So he makes that clear distinction present there, but also just we can't return to the same logic that Jesus is trying to escape us out of, which would just be to simply return to this kind of revolutionary mode of, we got to overthrow the state. The state is the cause of all these problems.
That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's the temptation, though, from coming in.
I understand. I understand that, and that's why I try to be mindful of that. And my natural political audience would be conservatives and libertarians and things like that. And I'm not really comfortable in any camp. I'm just trying to work this thing out as we go and understanding these things. And to me, it's very clear that Jesus says that, turn the other cheek, do not resist evil with violence. And I don't understand how you can be a Girardian and understand the power of the sacred in its attempt to try to make you, if I'm in a crowd, it's okay to do violence. Well, crowds are not just the crowd that you see looting the Target. They're the crowd that goes into a voting booth and hides behind a veil and hires somebody to execute actions against nonviolent people that you yourself would not do and would be repulsive for you to do as an individual Christian, and you know it. And we all know it, but it's because we're still in the sacred, it's hard for us to fully see it. Well, and then what we do is we're scared. I don't want to scapegoat the sacred, so I'll just act like I didn't see it. It's like no. And so my idea is I'm not like no. I have no critique against the state, really. All I'm saying is I'm critiquing the culture that allows us to wash our hands of the violence that we are hiring on our behalf. Now, I'm very open about this. I'm very like, I'm not dogmatic about what the solution is really, but what I'm suggesting is like, look, it's clear that if you see someone on the street trying to assault a little old lady, and you have the ability to physically restrain that attacker, right? And you do so, that's okay. Jesus is not like, darn it, you angry, mean person. You put your knee on the back of someone that was trying to hurt an old lady. No one's going to have a concern about that, right? But now, if you're going after your neighbor and they were selling raw milk because they're an Amish farmer, or they're selling a drug to somebody that wants it, and they're making a sermon that you're afraid could trigger some anti-gay attack, or they're any kind of thing. They don't want to buy your health care like Obamacare wants, or whatever nonviolent crime. I don't see how any Christian who understands Girard really gets it can ever say, yeah, I can just keep participating in the sacred. That's a sin. Jesus says, don't hurt your neighbor.
Well,
Do not resist evil with violence.
Yeah,
if it's evil to be poor, then don't resist the evil of poverty by using a gun against your rich neighbor to take more money from them. You see what I mean? I don't see how this is hard.
Well, it's definitely hard to work out practically how this stuff gets worked in, because we've been trying to work it in over the people of good faith and honest intentions have been trying to work it out for 2,000 years what it means. And I think we talked about some of this the last time we spoke. One of the problems, I think, is Girard's complete reduction of the sacred to violence. Is ultimately, Girard should start with his mimetic anthropology. So he should start with mimetic desire. And he does, right? It's just that this stuff gets oversimplified, I think. And Girard himself is, I think, guilty of maybe reducing it to a formula in a few places, which I want to come to in a second. But that you start with pride and envy, right? You start with superbia, the idea that my being is worth more and more important than your being, and that I'm entitled to that, and that what's good for you may not be immediately good for me because it puts the pride of my being in tension with the pride of your being. And so immediately right after that, you have the problem of envy. Right, and so your rise in my perception of your being causes envy within me, and then the natural fruit of that, once you've been expelled from the Garden of Paradise, the natural fruit of that is the story of Cain and Abel, where then you get rivalrous. That's where violence ultimately comes in. But you have to start the anthropology, I think, backwards, where the Bible starts it, which is in the garden first, before the fall, and finally to the violence outside of paradise and the founding of the city of man. So I think Girard was, his discovery of the scapegoat mechanism as the key to unlocking the whole organization of culture and the way in which we're capable of understanding and operating within that domain, made him get ahead of himself in terms of mapping that on theologically and what that means in terms of our relationship with the sacred. And so then I think he makes a further mistake in where he takes the principalities and the powers and says that the only thing that the principalities and the powers are is this collective violence. Effectively, it's the collective violence that structures everything for us pre-consciously in terms of our own awareness, and to which we give all obeisance to. And that's what Satan really is, and that's what demons and the demonic really are. And I don't think that's really justified. I mean, Girard's at that point. Girard's giving in to an academy that is in the sway of being dominated by a philosophical materialism, and he's already denied that materialism by assuming that God exists and that God acted in history, and that it was through God's own action that we were able to finally deconstruct all of this and to understand it because of the effect that the gospel had on our history. And so if materialism is false because God exists, because for materialism, only if there's even one thing that exists that isn't material, then materialism is false, then why is it that we would try to go from the anthropological discovery of the scapegoat mechanism and assume therefore that the spiritual realities, which were also revealed by Christ, are not actual real realities, and that the corruption of these are playing out at the anthropological level is in fact already driven and exacerbated and manipulated by real spiritual powers that we do battle with, not flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. So I think Girard's and part of me is even hesitant to go there because I don't want to put Girard is so far ahead. I don't want to put a stumbling block ahead in people's way in terms of getting to Girard. I need them to get to Girard so that we can actually even.
Have you read so much Rene Girard that you're in a state of mimetic undifferentiation in which you're trying to assert arbitrary differences between you and him so that you can maintain your sense of self?
No, and see that's actually a key point too, is that Girard also made the mistake of saying that love equals undifferentiation, and this is actually really important when you begin to work in and to think about
maybe codependent love, right?
No. I mean specifically. So Girard says that the ultimate effect of the gospel is this leveling effect that takes place across all of society, right? And he attributes that to Christianity, where I'm not sure that it shouldn't be attributed to desire itself, which just abhors having anything above it. With equality, it's not so much for the average, for the masses that I see out there, it's not so much about lifting up the poor and the oppressed as it is about bringing down anyone who's above me, right? This is what the Marxists do, is they claim to be on the side of the oppressed and the victimized, but in reality, all they do is resent anyone who happens to be above them. And you see this taking place in the family, and I see actually that love, when it's true charity, is actually differentiated love. It's love that recognizes the difference between me and the other, while at the same time in dwelling in the Holy Spirit. I think these are very fine-grained kind of critiques that have I think significant implications later on when we start to map all of Girard's anthropology onto Christian theology.
Well, I agree with a lot of that. I think that the idea, I say this a lot, that the Christian, the gospel haunting on the West for 2,000 years that's been infecting what we have today. And so we have this line that you can kind of trace, and it's infected our institutions for some time. And what it does is it has this it creates this slow but sure awareness of the ghastly nature of our institutional practices of scapegoating. And it makes us kind of be abhorred to the kind of way that we've treated those who have been marginalized and those who have been, in the hot seat or the crosshairs of the violence and the bludgeon of sacrificial practices, namely the immigrant, namely the racial minority, namely women, because of their differences in physical strength and so forth, and the different statuses that they held in society and how they would be used. Those weaknesses could be used as an occasion to sacrifice. And so what I think is happening is that our awareness of the scapegoat mechanism, it makes us want to scandalize differentiation itself rather than repent of the violence. And I think we need to switch it. It's a self-righteous thing that we do. We want to scandalize differentiation because it is true that differentiation can be the occasion. It can, emphasis on can, it can be the occasion for scapegoat.
Well, for sure.
But see, what we do in our self-righteous zeal is that we don't want to repent of violence because that's really addictive, even though it's not provided the catharsis that we want. We want to be able to have revenge of the nerds Christianity, scapegoating in the name of the land, in the name of the trans dwarf, lesbian, Muslim, every kind of minority attribute we can assert. We want to lift that up and protect them at all costs. And it's like, okay, but the thing is you want to justify the revivification of the sacred, of the act of using violence to marginalize the oppressors and to continue the cycle, which just is going to devolve into mimetic rivalry of people pretending to be martyrs and fighting over each other, and then schismatically creating new mutations constantly of new communities. Like, for example, I always illustrate like the LGBT parade that happened in New York one time, and they said no cisgendered drag queens allowed because they wanted to make a statement that they are not included within, because they're cisgendered and they're drag queens, that they were not invited to participate in the trans space that was taking place within that parade. And so that's an example of you're excluding another marginalized group, and then the person that's being marginalized tends to create a new founding community based on that exclusive event.
Yeah,
right. And so that's the way of the cross, always being crucified outside the camp, and we're all imitating
that's
the
way of the scapegoat mechanism. Really, is more.
But
That's
it's
the
the way,
class.
no, it's the way of the Christian. It's the way of the Christian awareness of the scapegoat mechanism. Because of the old scapegoat did not get their power because of their victim status. Now, if you scapegoat somebody, the very scandalous act that they are being accused of, but which makes them excluded, becomes their martyr's purge. We didn't have that in the past.
No, for sure. And the main transformation that took place, and this just goes completely unacknowledged in everyone who does like something like, I don't know, secular ethics, like analytic philosophical ethics, or people who are trying to talk about ethics and morality in the contemporary landscape, is there's just no homage paid to the fact that what really changed with the gospel was whose side God was on in terms of all of these relationships. Right. The gods previously would, of course, only been on the side of the community and the differentiated structure which overlay it. Then, of course, God reveals himself to be on the side of the marginalized, the person, even going so far as to say that he is them, right? That right. as you do unto them, you do unto God.
Right, the prisoner and so forth.
Yeah. Right, and so that moral revolution took place, but now in secular ethics, they don't pay any homage to the fact that they just take it all for granted that's the way that that the good is involved in caring for the marginalized and the persecuted. I mean, in the pagan world of antiquity, when reason started to detach itself a little bit from religion, philosophy, justice, Athens and Rome, you had attention paid to justice, right, as an ideal, but there was no notion that of the direct relationship and association with God Himself and the orientation of the sacred. So all of that has been completely upended and transformed. But what's going on in terms of the attack of right now in terms of the anti-Christian parody of Christianity that's going on is it's just desire which is railing up against any and all prohibitions that stand in its way, and specifically any prohibitions that were engendered by the previous schema of prohibitions that it inherited. So in our case, that's we live in a Judeo-Christian civilization. Judeo-Christianity has all this heritage of sexual prohibitions, which were taken as background and normative. The teeth on all of those prohibitions came out a long time ago, but those desire is just railing up against even the perception that they're
by desire. I would say the first part of the satanic mechanism, which is to create the scandal, right? Well, so this is the scandal of desire, the scandal of being not allowed to pursue your desire, right? And that resistance to the
right. The only prohibition is against prohibition. Yes,
right. But I want to try to put another positive spin on that. Okay, because what I see, it's not a spin. I think it's really clear.
I don't think it's all negative either, right? Yeah. Like we have seen real liberation take place, and we've seen and there have been many genuine advancements that have gone place. But all of this has gone apace in just complete blindness and ignorance as to what actual dynamics are being played out, and we're not getting any help, whether those be from our high priests in the academia who are supposed to explain how all this stuff really works and enlighten us as to why it is that all this is taking place. This has all just been entirely
What's all
confused.
Taking place?
Well, the move towards, so I mean, it's like Girard says in Things Hidden in How to Understand Liberals or Conservatives, liberals and like left versus right, is that the liberals want to move forward and obliterate any and all prohibitions that stand in the way, and those on the right are on the side of the prohibitions, because they realize that if you don't have the prohibitions, ultimately what you're left with is just the reign of mimetic rivalry, which will just be catastrophic.
And here's the Christian third way, I think, which is not all prohibitions should be laws. And the moment that we confuse that, and the moment that we make so rules are separate from laws, criminal laws. The moment we use the initiation of violence, we're disobeying the law of Christ that He commands us to adhere to. What? I'll just watch it out. And then what happens is we've crossed over from the way of rules and prohibitions, which should be taught at a civic level, at a cultural public square level. They're not the domain of the private. Okay, so let's be clear. I'm not saying let's just do your little church stuff in the closet. No, I'm saying no. The church should have a public witness. The church should say you shouldn't do a drug. You shouldn't be an adulterer. But the idea of criminalizing adultery, I think, would be the place in which Satan would use that, attempt to use the scapegoat mechanism. All right,
well,
now
you're
committing adultery. Now we're going to put you in a cage. Well, that's the thing. Here's the line. So the line is we have to have a kind of biblically consistent, line to measure that which should be a law and that which should be a prohibition and a desire. Does that make sense? So I'm not against laws. I am for laws. I'm the only one here for law and order. Now, I'm not saying you are not. I'm just saying, like in this conversation of society, I'm the guy advocating for law and order. I am not advocating the abolition of law. I'm advocating the biblical Christ-like way of mediating law, which is that it should be based on real violence. That's the place in which you employ the use of the law. So, for example, we know, think about alcohol, right? There's a lot of women in America at the Prohibition era. The women's suffrage movement, they were connected to this. And they were seeing a lot of abuse. They were seeing a lot of abandoned families. They were seeing a lot of abuse from men who were getting drunk and being very bad. And so they saw that sin, and they said, we got to do something. And so what they did is they immanentized the eschaton, which is what you're accidentally advocating for.
No, I mean something very different.
But all right, but all right, I won't go there. But the point is like they're immanentizing because what they're saying is, okay, look, we can use the state here on earth to make a heavenly outcome, to stop these people who are abusing their wives on alcohol or abandoning their family. We can stop it. We can actually create a Christian-like outcome. So they took a shortcut to heaven that led to hell. And that hell was an asking Satan, the powers that were destroyed on the cross, saying, hey, powers.
No, Caesar was not destroyed on the cross, though.
Paul says so. If the powers had known what they were doing, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory, because he has revealed and destroyed the entire system of coherence.
No, well, what the cross has done is unmask the confusion that would associate the power of Caesar with the power of God. But
it's also destroyed the ability of the powers to actually maintain their own satanic kingdom of Satan, casting out Satan. What's the Satan? Wait, let me finish the analogy of the alcohol. Yeah. The Satan is the man drunk on alcohol, right? That's the Satan. And then it's cast out by the Satan of the state saying, here's a gun. You're not allowed to do alcohol. Now, what does that create? That is a rebellious sin against Christ's order. Because what you're doing is, he says, do not resist evil with violence. And then these people who wanted a prohibition law said, excuse me, Jesus, you're wrong. I will resist the evil of drunkenness with violence. I'm going to put a gun to people's heads if I see them drinking. If they have a bar open, I will use the violence. I will initiate violence to stamp out the Satan of alcohol drunkenness. And so what happens is when you try to revivify Satan, casting out Satan, it falls apart. And what's the falling apart? The falling apart is the violence, the chaos, the 75 murder rate per capita in Tampa Bay, which during alcohol prohibition was double what today's Chicago and Detroit murder rate is. You see what I mean?
No, I think you've wildly gone ahead of what the gospel is capable of doing. Christianity can only mean going in voluntarily, right? No one enters into the kingdom, and everyone who does so enters in violently. It means our voluntary participation, and at the utmost, ultimately, it means what's been classically done. If you were a really serious Christian and you gave away all your possessions, you lived a life of chastity and obedience. You created your little. You worked to participate in the creation of a little kingdom on earth, and hoped that Caesar would leave you alone and not bother you too much. And pray, and you'd pray for the whole world. You'd pray for Caesar, for all the societies, for all the people. But that is something that can only be entered into individually. It's up to every individual to come to the water and to be transformed. And outside of that, we're still dealing with a world that's possessed, that's still run by the order of the logic of violence, that still will that isn't perfect. And I mean, as we know, Christians fall outside of the rule of the kingdom all of the time. But they at least know that they ought not to, right? They know that they shouldn't steal. But in a world where things are fallen and broken and imperfect, you have this base level of service of which the government provides, which is to carve up means by which we're all able to live together. And then you can have actions or laws that are instituted or ways arranged in the government that are simply unwise. So it was simply unwise for the temperance movement to go all
By
the
what
way.
standard?
By the standard of wisdom, right? Like you have to work.
Who's the standard of wisdom?
Well, that's it.
Jesus, right?
You have he's the fount of all wisdom, of course.
But you don't think that the statement "do not resist evil with violence" has a social ordering effect? That's actually a fundamental understanding of the way supply and demand and the way law works and the way violence that works.
But you've already made the concession that seeing a little old lady get mugged on the street means that you're allowed to apply physical force in order to.
But all right. So let's get our definition.
So you're resisting violence with violence.
That's not. Let me explain.
That is precisely resisting violence with violence.
I'll explain what I mean by that.
Okay.
So violence. Okay, is when you're initiating aggression. Now, is it now? So we're using these words, and there's a little bit. Yeah,
well, we need to do some definition. Let's do some
violence. So technically, yes, in the midst of restraining an attacker on a little old lady, it could technically say, "Oh, that was violent. You punched him when he grabbed you, or something." You know what I mean? But at the end of the day, it's defensive force, and I think that is a manifestation of proper Christian ethics applied to society. So therefore, if it's okay for you to physically restrain that attacker to keep them off the victim, therefore, as a Christian, you can extend that same moral right as a collective thing, saying, "Thou shalt not attack, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not attempt assault, thou shalt not." So it's based on a victim. It's based on a victim.
But
you see what I mean?
No, I don't. The same logic is then extended to the temperance movement. It's defensive violence. You're trying to defend. You're trying to defend. You're trying to defend
preemptive violence.
Right. Well, whatever. You're defending against the violence that is argued will necessarily occur if people are allowed to get wantonly drunk and to make gin in their bathtubs and to do all these kinds of things.
That's the mistake of the sacred of the fallen worldly powers, is that what they're. I'll make it clear so you won't be confused about what I'm saying. because I think it's good. It's good that you're asking these questions. These are very important, and you're a Girardian, and this is something we should be able to work out. So the idea is that. When you have the initiation of violence to stop an action that could lead to violence, that is wrong in my Christian ethical understanding, because what you're suggesting is it's preemptive violence, just like preemptive war. I'm going to go bomb Iraq because they could at some point come and get us. That's what George W. Bush said, right? And that, from a Christian standpoint, you would say that's unethical. Right, you're preemptively invading a country because they may at some point, if they're allowed to have freedom, that they may exercise that freedom in a way that is dangerous to us. But that's different from like a country's invading us and we're going to attack that. I think that's okay.
No, but do the thought experiment this way. Let's say that our attacker of the old woman gives you a note that says, "I'm going to attack this old woman tomorrow at 1 p.m." You know that he's serious and whatever, and that you know that he's actually going to do it. Are you allowed to go in and preempt that attack? Of course you are.
Sure, but I'll give an example. That would be if you make a statement saying, "I threaten, I'm going to come kill you." I think it's obvious that the law should physically restrain it. Now, here's the difference: to jump from that to alcohol and say, well, because the people are drinking, they could get violent. See what I'm saying? It's a different thing. It's not a fundamentally violent act to drink. It's not a fundamentally violent act to sell alcohol. What's that bad action is when you abuse that substance and then you do bad things. And so the idea from a Christian standpoint is we don't want to initiate violence against things as a preemptive violence, because at that point we've entered into this undifferentiated chaos in which the crowds of the voting public can make anything a crime, and therefore it's a scapegoat mechanism free-for-all in which you could say, well, we're going to stop alcohol because that substance could lead to violence. So therefore we're going to preemptively use violence to stop it. What does that do? Creates a nasty, violent black market, kills a lot of people, introduces moonshine instead of the original wine and beer. And then the next thing what happens is someone says, well, hey, you criminalized alcohol because it could lead to violence if people drink it. Well, I'm going to criminalize your pastor's sermon because he says that marriage is between a man and a woman, and someone in the flock could hear that and get triggered and want to go hurt gays. So therefore, that's hate speech. Therefore, if your pastor says that again, he's going to prison. So that's my standard. It's very clear. You don't initiate violence because something could theoretically be the occasion for violence. You only use force to stop real acts of violence, trying to harm children. They don't have the agency, and you're trying to sell them an AK-47. That's a violent act. That's an illegitimate act. Trying to harm children, fraud, theft, burglary, assault, rape, murder. All of those things should always be collectively considered to be the bounds of law, which is all based on the protection of the human life.
Yeah,
it's all about common law.
Well, I think all of those examples are uncontroversial and in line with the ethic of the kingdom. I think so many of these things though really come down to, again, just practical wisdom, which are going to be debates about what is prudential in a given situation, and people are going to have large disagreements over what is and what isn't, whether you should drive on the left side of the road or the right side of the road or whatever it's going to be.
Right.
But the point is that there is going to be rules mandated by force by which you're obliged to obey because of your common participation in a shared social order. And I think that's okay. It's not anti-Christian. It's not against the gospel ethic. It's not violence that's being has an overarching totalitarian control over the world.
But but you said the gospel is all about voluntary action, right?
Well, the government is only necessary because we don't live in the kingdom of God, right? Because we're in this in-between period between the final revelation and the ultimate final judgment. And we don't know how long that in-between period is going to go on for. Maybe it'll be one more day, or maybe it'll be 100,000 years. We have absolutely no idea. So in the meantime, while things are imperfect, and while the gospel is not fully saturated, and while not everyone has voluntarily signed up to take up their cross, in the in-between state, we have this relationship of I think what most Girardians call the catechon, which are the restraining powers. They aren't Satan. I mean, they can act satanically. They can be critiqued when they do, but they're not in themselves evil. They're the powers that hold things in order.
I'm not saying that either. So what I'm suggesting is that we're in a kind of we're in a trajectory. We're going somewhere. And so the idea of saying, let's snap our fingers and let's just do without a state, that's not happening. And that's okay, right? I'm not advocating for defund the police. I'm not advocating for open borders. Those are zealous revolutionary attacks against order that are not based in a Christian witness against evil power. What I'm suggesting is we have an obligation, if we're living in a society in which we're asked to participate by our Caesar. See, the Paul, those folks, and Peter, they didn't have that same thing. They did not have the, hey, Caesar's telling you, hey, if you're on a jury, Peter, you can decide the morality of the law. We do have that, at least in America, where our founders intended the jury system to be a check on evil law. And that's why they struck down the Fugitive Slave Act by jury nullification, saying, yes, the facts of the case say that, you violated the Fugitive Slave Act, but I'm a Christian. And I cannot employ violence to punish you for this action because this is an illegitimate law. And Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and so forth wrote about this as the intentional feature of the jury system. And so what I'm suggesting is Christians should pay more than what they are asked of by Caesar. Pay more, because when they come for your cloak, give them your tunic too. So pay more. I'm not saying
we can't all be monks.
I'm not saying
right?
starve. I'm not saying starve, try to be a politically dissident. I'm not at all. I'm saying obey everything. But the difference between you obeying and then you executing unjust laws is a big difference. You see what I mean? So that means you obey the law. So just to be clear, the law says you don't smoke marijuana, then Craig, you don't smoke marijuana. That's the law. Now, if you're on a jury system, I don't know what it is like over there in Canada, but in America,
very similar, yeah.
If you're on a jury system in America and you see a guy, they say, yeah, he's going to go away for a year or 2 years because we found a little bag of weed or whatever, and he also had a little firearm in his back pocket. So you say, wait a second, did he use it on anybody? No, he just had it, and therefore our law says mandatory minimum, he's going to get 20 years or whatever. And you're looking at the facts, and you're a jury member, and you know what your Caesar told you, which is judge the character of the law as well if you're on a jury. Then how in the blue heck can you as a Christian say, no, I'm going to throw my little stone with 12 other stones and say, put him in a cage with rape. Go ahead. He got high or he sold marijuana. Put him in a rape cage. That's an act of violence, man. That's an act of violence that the sacred is enclosing so we can't see it. And all I have to do is just explain it and deconstruct it, and then you see how ugly it is. Would you want to be the guy taking that mother of a little kid who was dating a guy who did cocaine and putting her in the cage and locking the door as she's crying out and her little child back home is crying? No, that's sick. And the fact that Christians are not actively dismantling these bad laws is the reason why we're reaping the whirlwind of the chaos in our society that those laws sow, because they're illegitimate in Jesus's kingdom. So I think we have a difference. I think you have the two kingdom theology or something. I don't know.
Well, I think it's fair to say that I would line up pretty squarely with the idea of the two cities, of the city of man and the city of God, and I think Girard does as well, even explicitly so.
I'd say there's two kingdoms and there's one king though. There's one king that we as Christians are to be witnessing to. So if we're in a participation, sure, the secular judge can throw the man in a cage. Yeah, if he doesn't have Christ as his sovereign, then yeah, he'll do whatever lawless people do. But as for me and my house, when you ask me to judge a neighbor, I have a moral responsibility to understand that I don't have to throw my stone and send that boy into a rape cage or that woman into a rape cage.
But David, these aren't exactly new difficulties that Christians have grappled with over the course of 2,000 years. Whether or not it's okay. It's Augustine, Aquinas. An unjust law is no law at all. You can find that even in antiquity. And then, how do you work out, is it right to lie to the axe murderer if you're hiding people in your house and an axe murderer is coming to get them? Can you lie to the axe murderer? I mean, Kant says no, you have to be perfectly deontological and tell the truth. Although maybe you could be evasive, although even that is kind of throws off a goodwill. So these questions have always been up for debate. I don't think there's anything radically new that comes in as a result of understanding the scapegoat mechanism and the confusion of violence and the sacred as it's existed throughout human history that isn't already touched upon by engagement of questions of justice that's been navigated through for a very long time. And they're interesting questions. They are definitely, but those kinds of hard cases of what to do in that case when you're a juror, if you think the law is unjust, your conscience has to be your guide in those kinds of situations. To me,
it's so obvious why we have chaos.
I think the problem is to confuse the structure with as the evil that needs to be fought against, when in fact it's the content of the structure that needs to be critiqued and reevaluated and thought about, and ideally you'd want to have the most just state that has the most just laws that operates in a fashion that doesn't respects human liberty and human freedom and all the aspects of our nature. That's of course ideal, but the way that gets worked out in its particular modes is going to differ in so many different ways, and people are going to have all different kinds of ideas about how to do it, and that's okay. There's nothing essential within the structure that makes it satanic.
Well, the satanic thing is a scandal, like alcohol being cast out by the violence of Satan expelling that person into a cage and then creating a violent black market. That's the scandal. The scandal is that when you use law in a lawless manner, it reaps a chaotic state of destruction that we're experiencing in a decivilization manner right now.
Oh yeah, no. Look.
So I do think there is a very clear biblical. I understand that these things can be hard in working out them on the precise details, but I do think there's a clear biblical standard that if we are going to be asked, this is something that goes outside of the Bible, which is these New Testament folks they're not being asked by their Caesar, hey, keep me in check. Our Declaration of Independence says, which is part of our U.S. national code, says, when a government becomes injurious to the means of liberty, you can alter or abolish it. And then it creates these systems. Our founders create these systems that say, check us, please, if we go crazy. And use your moral compass. And so what I'm saying is, in a country like America, where we have 70% say they're Christian, all my standard is say, okay, if that's true, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus put somebody in a cage? Now, if we've started doing that, here's what would happen. We would scratch the itch of justice that the social justice folks are trying to scratch, but we would scratch it much more powerfully so, which would take their moral authority away from their societal perch and cripple their ability to stoke that mimetic desire in their envy. So what I'm saying is, look at what the things that these people in the protests have been asking for. No knock raids. They want to get rid of them. Well, from a biblical standpoint, as I've said, no victim, no crime. It's a very simple grid for me. You don't go into barging into people's houses for a nonviolent crime in the first place. So if we would actually act like Christians, like 70% of us say we are, if we would start to learn what the implications of that look like in the ballot box and in the jury system, then we would scratch the itch for justice that our society is having as it becomes aware of the victims that Girard points out we will become aware of. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, it does. And if the idea is just, we need better moral theology and to enlighten Christians as to whether or not this or that law or practice really squares with the gospel, then that's definitely a good project to be taken up and to carried forward. My whole worry is just is to where this gets situated and mapped in with mimetic theory itself. But yeah, that's it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think Girard says over and over again, we have to renounce all participation in collective violence, and that sounds like what I'm saying for you to do. There's a collective. It's called a jury.
Oh no!
They want to put a man in a cage. They want to put a man in a rape cage.
This is definitely where I think I think we just keep going over the same point over and over again. Is that it's not.
You don't see anything. He says Girard says renounce our participation in collective violence if we don't want to perish. You see what I mean? No, he does. I'll show you the quote.
Yeah, no, that's. So Osher Clausewitz, right? His last major work, is where he kind of works out where his theory. I mean, he compares it to Clausewitz being called Hegel with mud on his boots. So it's where do the theoretical principles, right? Like if it was the kingdom of God, then you're right. We wouldn't have any need for collective violence because everyone would act in such a way that is according to divine imitation, and it would be a perfect kingdom of love, and any of these cataclysmic means would totally be unnecessary. But given that we're not there, where does this meet up into history? So, was it fine for the West to engage in World War II and to take down Hitler? Was it fine to oppose the Soviet Union and communism during the Cold War? Were these wars? Could you talk about just wars? And this is where I think actually again, just to come back to my critique of again, I don't want to cast any shade on Girard because I need people to get. We should all want people to get to Girard so that we could then maybe a reason from there. But this is Girard says emphatically yes that he's not a pacifist. That in the quote, the book right next to me, he says he's not a pacifist, says so openly, and in so doing affirms that war is sometimes necessary and prudent, and the governments are good. He identifies himself as a conservative, which means holding on to the system of prohibitions and the normative structure that has I would argue been so responsible for causing the West to flourish for such a long period of time. So I think there have been some Girardians who have badly read Girard and confused, and I'm speaking mostly of Girardians that I know who are on the left, who are like getting behind and seeing Black Lives Matter as this ultimate gospel triumph or something like that. But I think that there's this massive confusion of equating Girard as a pacifist, and there's other.
I'm not a pacifist.
Yeah. Okay. So given that you're not a pacifist, then sometimes violence is okay, and that includes violence.
I don't call that violence. I call that self-defense.
Well, we could call it something different, but it still is what it is according to the theory.
But the very clear. All I'm saying is that the Christian standard that I think is very compatible with what Girard has done here with his work is that you draw the line. If you're going to have a state, it should be protecting us from actual violent acts, fraud. You're trying to sell a little old lady beachfront property. That's an illegitimate act of confiscation of her property. Therefore, you have a law that says, no, you don't do that, or you get punished.
But these are I don't want to belittle. Like these are political questions, right? These are matters of prudential disagreement.
Right. No, but it's very anthropological, because what I'm suggesting is the reason why we're seeing the chaos in the West that we're in is because Satan takes advantage of our apathetic complacency with a satanic abusive use of the state, right? Do you see what I mean? because we are complicit in the perpetuation of a nanny state, which has become so lawless, anarcho-tyranny, as the word might be. Anarcho-tyranny is what I'm critiquing. I want law and order. I want law that actually makes sense morally, that's actually rooted in real skin in the game.
But
that's based on.
So does everyone in politics, and
right,
there's but they don't have to
about. But Christ is clear: don't resist evil with violence. That's not talking about self-defense. It's talking about shame.
For me, we've beaten this particular sacrificial victim to death. So let's move on to another one if we can.
Well, Craig, I appreciate you working those things out. It's important to have those discussions. So I really enjoyed that.
No, it's great.
I know it's a little bit cumbersome when you're going around and around and the same thing, but I think it's helpful for people to hear these things thought about.
Well, and it is okay to disagree too, right? So you present different interpretations and see what you think makes sense.
I'm trying to get Zizek on my side, but it's a little bit of.
Oh wow! No, I think you have a major uphill struggle.
Did you see my little discussion with him?
I did actually see that, and I mean, for me, it just revealed just how that I don't think he's really read Girard all that well, or understands what Girard is saying in terms of how he understands the relationship of what he's interested in to Christianity, and then to his whole atheist to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I just kind of want to throw it back to you now, because at the beginning I was talking about what do you see before we recorded. I was saying, what do you see this big, I can't remember the word. You were talking about how it's so hard to critique, mainstream scientific ideas and make progress. So what do you think is that big thing, that big other or something that's out there keeping us in this kind of glass ceiling? I've laid out my kind of formula, which is the presence of too much state monopoly, which is the presence of the sacred, and then it's the lack of our courage to be able to challenge these sacred cows of knowledge, and therefore we're stagnating because we're not innovating, we're not growing the pot. So what's your big description of what's going on?
I wish it was more exciting, but it's just the normal villains, which is evil and stupidity. Right, it's sin and ignorance that are ultimately to blame for all of. Well,
why are we in it now so much compared to, say, when Tesla was creating AC and he was creating, and then you had the Orville, the Wright brothers, and they're creating flights. Like, why is it like boom, 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 and then stag?
Yeah.
That's what I'm kind of getting.
I mean, Thiel's whole critique of the technological slowdown, especially in the world of atoms rather than the world of bits. It's a huge, wide-ranging critique of all the things that have gone wrong since maybe the end of the 50s and into the 1960s. Ultimately, like, there are so many good critiques that are out there and being discussed right now, on different channels and podcasts, and there's a lot of really good stuff. I'm tempted to where I'm most inclined in terms of looking for the bedrock difficulties are really the loss of a really resilient and robust Christianity in the West. Christianity has been the leaven and the foundation, even the unacknowledged foundation in a lot of ways for so much of what has worked in the West for so long. And losing that has resulted in all of the stacking up of problems that could not have been anticipated from abandoning the pattern of imitation that had gone before and the wholesale rejection of the thing. So I think it's really a general, not only loss of faith, but loss of sophisticated and catechized faith. I mean, a lot of people are really philosophically and theologically ignorant in comparison with the past, and unable to do critical thinking and critical theology, and to really know the program of what God's plan is for us that was provided previously by the church and society and given tacit or explicit support by the secular powers.
So are you suggesting like that the average layperson should be very philosophically educated in theology?
No, not even so much like you need to know your Plato and Aristotle and church fathers, and you should be able to recite Aquinas or something like that. No, absolutely not. But just there was a kind of catechesis and grounding in what the faith is and what it means, that was well ingrained in people up until about the end. Like there was, I mean, speaking from my own tradition, the Roman Catholics went with Vatican II in 1964. Well, a few years in the 1960s. And as a result, I mean, there's all kinds of, there's Catholics who have a whole bunch to say about what happened there, but you saw this in mainline Protestantism as well, where there's this big watering and dumbing down of the faith. And as a result, people really kind of lost meaning of the faith, of why they needed it and what it was. And it was that loss of meaning that ultimately led to, I think, the departure, although there's a whole bunch of other things culturally that are going on in the background and at the same time that are also having a major force and impact. But anyway, I think it's the loss of that common sense of that common sense of the faith that was shared both by Catholics and Protestants and by well-educated people as well. Like if you were like a philosopher and you had a philosophical education, you might not be a believer, but you knew what the believers believed, and you knew the sophistication of their beliefs, and you knew the kinds of expectations and the norms and what justified them and why things worked, and you could speak to what was good about it. Whereas now it's just this kind of like, even the atheism is so crass. Even the atheism has been dumbed down. It's just been a general impoverishment, and in many ways things have radically improved. But then when you look at something as basic as the correspondence between the American founding fathers and the sophistication with which they were able to wield language and concept, you also see massive regression. So those who have only seen progress have just been entirely ignorant of all the things that have been decaying over time as well, even while things have.
So what do you think makes that general decay in knowledge and quality of discourse and education and all these different things that you're touching on? What do you think is creating that?
Yeah, it's again, answering the why there would obviously be very difficult because it's going to be this massive confluence of factors. I think
is there one elephant in the room that
well, there's just so much there, right? Like there's so much that's been going on. You had the advancement of a kind of scientific mode which came to see religion as essentially stupid, right, and just wrote it off entirely. And then that became kind of normalized within the academy. And then you had two kind of generations that went through the academy of the idea that religion is just stupid, essentially. And so there was a kind of background atheism that came to all of the positions of power within the institutions of government, media, anywhere where you're making a six-figure salary or something like that. And that just basically kind of trickled down to a general osmosis and stupefying of everything, because there wasn't anything that really filled in to replace it. Like what? Okay, if you are a sophisticated mind, you have what? Matter in motion and the laws of nature that's gonna outline how things are supposed to go. Worse yet, maybe you'll clamp onto some ideology like revolutionary communism or something like that, which is extremely unsophisticated in terms of its ways of analyzing and carving up the world. Or you're going to just go and dive into monsters and go down the whole Freudian hellhole and back into primitive myth to look for the true nature of all of human aspiration. So things became so bogged down and stupefied and confused in so many ways that all of that just kind of I think ultimately led to, and with this constant propaganda of the ridicule of all religious faith and of God, led to a kind of general abandonment. And there's all and okay, so that's the one picture that comes from outside Christianity. There's the inside Christian critique too, that Christians have been vengeful, angry, petty, stupid, jealous, have wanted to ban anything that might be considered pleasurable or interesting. There's all kinds of critiques that you can make from Christianity's failure to understand and know itself and to propagate itself effectively as well. But what did happen is that throughout all of the West, this has taken place, and now that's, I think, where we're seriously reaping what we've sown over the last several generations, last two or three generations.
So, what do you think, if there is any, what do you think is the benefit or the corrective that introducing and developing mimetic theory and Girard's ideas, what can they have in this problem that you're describing?
Well, you always ask small questions, right?
I'm just trying to get an overall picture of where do you.
No, it's great. It's great. Yeah. So first of all, there's within Christianity. So it's understanding. It's ultimately helping us to understand, at least at the level of the anthropological, what Christianity is all about. What's been missed. It's certainly a scandal that we talked, I think this was actually the very first thing that we talked about when we first talked was, why did it take this French literary theorist 2,000 years later in Christian history in order to uncover the scapegoat mechanism at the foundation of human culture? And partially it was because Christianity had to be able to think outside of itself in order to make that discovery. It really is an anthropological critique outside of religion that operates as a theory of religion that's then able to help us understand what's really been going on. And so that's hugely helpful. It provides an enormous amount of humility in terms of understanding Christian dogma and Christian history.
Mm-hmm.
I think it makes possible a dialogue at a level that was not really possible before, because there's a whole new kind of perspective and way of seeing that wasn't really present or visible, and where people were previously just holding on to their very sophisticated and tightly organized dogmatic theologies, which I think are very important, but that just simply became an excuse for differentiating, I'm a this and you're a that, and therefore, it just became an excuse for mimetic rivalry among Christians. So that's really important and is being worked in. Where I think it's even more important, though, is outside of Christianity, in terms of, there was kind of this question that's been around since the Enlightenment, basically, that says, okay, so let's say that God exists, but there's all of these different other religions that are out there, right? You have Muslims, you have Jews, you have Hindus, you have Zoroastrians, you have Shintoists, you have African particular spiritualities and religions, you have Native American, you have all these different religions. How is it that you're supposed to know that one is the true revelation? How is it that how is it from the outside that you're able to make any claim about which revelation is true, or which religion is the rational one? And finally, it was Girard's theory of religion that's able to deconstruct all of what's been going on in terms of religion previously, and then show where the Judeo-Christian revelation was different, that then gives us a rational response to that kind of many gods objection, which I think has been a stumbling block intellectually for a lot of people to honestly enter in, right? I don't think people are in bad faith hanging on to that objection. I think they're genuinely saying, well, how am I supposed to legitimately differentiate between all these different religious claims? And I think there was a lot you could do in terms of arguing the case for Christianity really well. There's been fantastic apologists all through that Enlightenment period, but there wasn't a really good, tight, rational, scientific, hypothetical answer that you could just hand over and was really powerful and decisive. So that will in time, we don't know how long it's going to take, maybe it's 100 years from now, but in time that will be a Girard's work will be absolutely decisive in the course of human intellectual history. I don't know how long it's going to take, but it will take eventually.
And how is that going to, can you describe how that would be, just for people? How will it be decisive for intellectual supremacy or whatever?
Because from the once we reach this period of scientific modernity, we're relying on a scientific hypothesis in order to bring us into a credible faith. Now, okay, people are going to get there through maybe their own private religious experience, or they're going to get there through their own reading and development. But at an academic intellectual level, there wasn't really an argument that you could lay down so simply and so persuasive that explained so much, and that was able to do was able to cut through all of the different comparative competing claims and to boil it down to something that is so simple and obvious, while at the same time being so explanatorily fruitful and verifiable. It's just a complete game changer.
So in other words, you're suggesting that the biggest long-term value of mimetic theory for the problems we have is that it provides one of the most persuasive apologetic paths towards Christianity for the outside world. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I think that's really excellently put. Yeah.
So that's exciting, because I agree with that. I think that's
okay.
Really
yeah,
great.
No, and
I just
also
want to kind of let that simmer.
Yeah, no, sink in for people for sure. I mean, and so that's at the level of theory of religion. But then even before that, it's human psychology, right?
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had a theory of psychology. I mean, the story of psychology is comical, right? It begins with Freud, which is just well, if you've ever dug into Freud, you know what it begins with, and then in the 20th century, it ends up with people poking gray matter and assuming that there's going to be some kind of philosophical anthropology that emerges out of there in order to explain the human person. No, it's so the very best that psychology has been able to get to is a kind of evolutionary psychology, which is, great at understanding us all the way up to chimpanzees, but doesn't really get much further than that in terms of offering any type of explanatory material, which you need if you're going to be engaged in something like a real social science, right? Like if you know anyone who knows this, I think you had James Lindsay on a little while back on your program, and he's doing a great job right now, and just in terms of showing the origins of this whole monster that we're witnessing right now. I wish he had Girard. Like I know you tried to get him to get him. I hope you.
That was a radio show, so it was a little bit more quicker.
Yeah, well,
it wasn't
really,
like this where we're doing more.
I really hope you're able to follow up with him and to bring Girard to him, because I think that's exactly what he's looking for. Although he might be put off by the fact that it's coming from a Christian background at first, he might have to smuggle it in there creatively.
Another one is Rechtenwald. Have you heard of him? I
haven't.
On the show.
But
he's another a leftist professor that has now gone against critical theory.
So but one of the things that he's recognized so well is that social science is important, and we don't have a social science. Well, you and I know that in fact actually we do. It's sitting right here on my shelf. I'd be happy to present it to you and get to work with it. But finally, when we realize the power and impact of what an objective human psychology actually means, and a real social science becomes possible, then we are in a whole new horizon in the space of human intellectual history. And so, yeah, extremely exciting. But
so that's a kind of Christian triumphalist in a good way, because what you're saying is that Jesus's intellectual project is really got its hooks in us, and it's going to succeed because it's got the truth. As St. Augustine, the truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose. It'll defend itself.
Right. Yeah, right. Beautiful. Yeah. I think that's. I mean, obviously, we're both Christians, and we both believe in the triumph of Christ, because we both believe in the resurrection. So whatever goes wrong here, it can only the worst it can be is death. Right. And he's triumphed over death. So
well, that's a good point. I want to ask you. Girard talks about that culture is based on the tomb, and then of course the interesting thing is that Jesus, his signature is the empty tomb, which is cool. It's like, okay, this is interesting. This is a kind of a challenge to what we think of as culture, right? And it's a
if we think of all culture as being driven ultimately by death, right? Like, if it's economics, it's scarcity, right? It's the divvying up of scarce resources. In politics, it's all about managing, the limits of death and vengeance and all those kinds of problems that we were talking about at length previously. But ultimately, what Christianity is life. It's being driven by life, and it's not conquerable by death. And that undoing of that in that sense of the satanic order that held humanity completely captive and is still holding it captive in a lot of ways is overcome and being overcome and will be overcome
and that Christian attitude has colored a lot of my perspective of economics and politics and everything.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I'm looking for the life the death drive stuff.
I see all that, and when I'm pushing back against it, I'm only doing so on very specific theoretical points, not in general. In fact, what I love so much of what you're saying in general, and it's so amazing that you're getting it out to more people, because it's a message that needs to be heard.
Well, thank you. And the thing that I want to kind of ask you is, have you changed your perspective, or has your attitude about death personally changed, having encountered mimetic theory and all the works that you've studied?
Well, in my own case personally, I became a Christian before I became a Girardian. And I'm kind of glad it went in that direction. Although I don't think it would be bad if it had gone in the opposite way. It was Christ being who he is was an impact on me before coming to Girard. But it was really interesting for me. I mean, I was at that point in life in where I was in the faith, is I was really struggling genuinely with a lot of these anthropological problems, like the origins of human culture and how to reconcile that with revelation. I was totally scandalized. I was already working on the problems of the inadequacy of psychology to actually explain human behavior and to be able to model.
So you were feeling in the dark for a lot of the things.
Yeah, and then like a bolt of lightning, Girard just landed in my lap.
That's how it was for me too. Yeah,
this is exactly what I needed when I needed it.
That's exactly what happened for me.
Yeah,
it's crazy. I was trying to shape out stuff. I did an audio book that was like, I was just recorded something, and it was like 88 pages. I was trying to map it out, and I had a lot of the pieces in place, and then Girard, boom, 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 came out of nowhere. And I was like, whoa, I don't need to act arrogant and act like I've got something original. I'm just going to try to like map some of the things that I'm feeling in the dark to what he's developed, because this is a person who's been doing this for a long time. He has some incredible, ideas and structures here that we need to take.
Well, if we're Christians, we're allowed to believe in providence.
I think so. But I mean, what I'm saying is, like, for me, I've been a Christian and grew up in the church, right? But for me, it was when I first encountered and I see Satan fall like lightning, his argument for the evidence of something supernatural happening around the real resurrection of Christ. I got kind of a little bit of a goosebump thing, because I was like, I felt like, whoa, like, wait a second. If it's because it's a scientific frame he's making, and I'm like, wait a second. If his premises check out, and that it had to be from outside of humanity.
Oh yeah, no,
because that's kind of a chilling moment where you're like, it's like I know it's kind of hokey to say, but it's like you feel like you're seeing a little bit of the fingerprints of God in history in a real. You're like, whoa, that's kind of awesome. You know what I mean? That's kind of interesting to touch that for the first time, because I was like you. I studied apologetics, and I never really found anything that I was like, these are kind of like silly arguments, They're kind of like word games and stuff. The Kalam argument, the cosmological. It's like, I don't know. But this is like the first time you can touch the fingerprints of God. If his scientific premises are correct, you could touch the fingerprints of God in history at that moment.
Well, it was just a completely different. I mean, I was training as an analytic philosopher, and so I was very familiar with all of the arguments for God's existence, for, against, going in through the inadequacies of how meta-ethics won't really work without any kind of proper transcending grounding. All these kinds. This was my background where I was trained.
Presuppositional apologetics. You got into that.
Well, yeah,
and all that.
Yeah. So that was all there. But for me, what was really interesting was just this, if we like, a bottom up mode. Whereby at the level of anthropology and solving the anthropological crime scene of human origins, it's the Gospels that's able to reveal it, undo it, and create the conditions of possibility by which a scientific theory of culture and humanity and anthropology could actually be developed, even if that happened to be almost 2,000 years down the line after that work was begun. But you have to think of where it began and the way that the world was when it began versus how things were at the time that Girard was able to bring it to hypothetical formulation.
Right. So did you see that kind of big aha moment for you spiritually on a personal level about the idea of death possibly? Like, I don't want to overstate it and try to be,
it's
the idea that, it's like, okay, mankind is enclosed in the sacred, and the only way you could create and like the evidence in history that this was a real resurrection as opposed to a false mythic resurrection was the fact that it created division. And I was like, whoa, that's that's a very interesting moment to think about, because it's like a scientific hypothesis that you can try to test in history to determine whether something outside of humanity was behind this event.
Furthermore, I mean, you had all the genius of antiquity. You had Plato, you had Aristotle, you had Socrates. None of them were able to detect the scapegoat mechanism. None of them were able to understand what religion was about. And neither was anyone else coming along after them. And so necessarily it had to have been a move from the outside that made it possible to deconstruct which was a model of imitation that was already operating on people, which foreclosed the possibility of its detection previously, which, I mean, it's just so simple and so staggering when you're actually able to apprehend it for the first time. As for whether or not it was Girard that brought about conversion, maybe a bit of reconversion for me, but anyone who's been through a real religious conversion knows just how overwhelming and all-consuming that kind of an experience is, and there's so many great testimonies. And Girard's whole I think doing a great job of articulating and showing when his work on novelistic conversion, what that conversion from being an angsty rebel who's only looking for scapegoats everywhere, who's finding blame with everyone and everything else around there, and then finally realizing, oh no, wow, shame on you, oh man, because every time you launch the finger of accusation, you have 3 more pointing right back at you, and then to realize that that's all situated within God, who's real and there, and that He has already worked and working and will work your forgiveness, and is doing that actively and is engaged in doing that right now. And you look back and you see you thought you were walking alone, and then you see that there was someone walking there with you the whole time in your life, and you're able to recognize these patterns that you just were completely oblivious to before. All of that, I mean, that's all of Christianity, and not just Girard. Although I think for a lot of people, Girard will provide anyone who's coming to theoretical stumbling blocks, will get through those stumbling blocks with Girard, and then I think go through that kind of
experience. The reason why I asked about death is I think death anxiety really is a big thing hanging over a lot of the problems.
Everything, everything.
And so it's like Ernest Becker's, death anxiety, but he's an anthropologist. I don't know.
Well,
where he goes off with some of this stuff.
Where your treasure is, there your heart is, right? And so if you're just got to get my own little slice of this treasure and pile it up and defend it off against everybody else, and there's not enough to go around, and my little precious ego is constantly in mimetic competition with everybody else, and if they win I lose, and oh no, right? But then once you realize that Christ has conquered all of this, you're able to get past that. And even though you're still operating in that world where things are death driven, and you have to navigate, and you have to be kind of subtle and swift as a serpent, as well as innocent as a dove to make your way through, you're no longer fully, well, at least hopefully you're not being fully driven by that same drivenness by death. I think the other thing as well is that in the world pre-conversion, it's all ego drama, right? Your whole world is just this gigantic ego drama, and then I think it's a Protestant theologian, Paul Tillich, talking about ego drama and theodrama. When you finally enter into the theodrama, you realize, no, God's at the center of all of this. He's got everything under control. He is love. All he wants us to do is to enter into a loving relationship with us, and for us to enter into loving relationships with each other, and to do things that are simple and good and wholesome and humble, and creative and dangerous but that God is ultimately at the center. And so we don't need to worry about occupying the center and to think it's life or death if this person is president or pope or whatever. It's God's already in the center. So we don't need to play that game.
I'm going to give you a tripart question to send us off. But before that, that goes back to kind of my original point that I was suggesting about science and the miracles of science, which is just simply another way of saying, like, in a world of unbelief, in a world of zero sum, you've got to create win-win solutions, right? Yep. The idea of that God lets the rain fall on the just and the unjust. And so to me, the Christian response should be this bold, when you look at people pointing fingers and saying, no, you're evil, no, you're evil, and you see that, what do? You can get in the middle of it and try to fight it out and pick a side. You can get in between it, probably get killed. Or you can go to your, go find your Galileos, go find your Nikola Teslas, and go make the world a little better. Because I think one of the things that we're supposed to do, I don't know if you saw my discussion with Jordan Hall, where I talked about the miracle of the fishes and loaves, as I saw that as a prophetic challenge to us in history to try to overcome scarcity with voluntary self-giving of our time through creative acts of scientific inquiry that escape us out of the mythic enclosure of violence and say, hey, you guys are blaming each other. Let me give you an example. You guys are blaming each other for all these problems. But if we created, just imagine that we created energy literally too cheap to meter. We cracked the code on that. We figured that out. And our homes and our houses and our transportation that moves our goods, everything gets totally transformed by that. And you don't have to fight wars over that. And you don't have to fight over your electric bill or your water bill and your gas bill that you have to put in. Imagine all those things if we could tackle that issue in our lifetime. Clean energy, no pollution, and so cheap and abundant that people could just power their homes and self off the grid. Now, imagine that could happen. And then imagine how much relief that gives to our pressure cooker society. People blaming, you're rich, you're poor, all this fighting. Like, if we could just, it's not going to solve everything. It's not utopia. But what does that do? Does that turn down the temperature of the boiler just a bit? Don't you see that? Does that make does that make us a little more relaxed, a little bit more happy to get along? Like, hey, wow, that's beautiful, right?
For sure. And as well, we see too that, once we have these anthropological tools, we can see why it is that, once you know the desire is mimetic, and you realize that this person fighting with this person is just this magnetic draw to get sucked into, and it ultimately creates this whole skewed vision of reality
there, yeah.
that orders everything. And the rational thing to do is to set off on these new and exciting goals that are in conformity with the kingdom. I don't think actually you're saying this, so I don't think it's really too much of a pushback, but I would say you can't, man cannot live on energy too cheap to meter alone. That ultimately there's even more that God wants to even transform us into His own essence, and to
personal character transformation.
Well, and to have us fully partake in His own life, right? To become saints ultimately, God willing. But that all of this, right? The cool and wise, the cool fresh air and the fresh breeze of wisdom that comes from the Gospels. Once we understand that, once we see the mimetic rivalry, which is just structured by, again, that scarcity and death drivenness, and know that there are other ways that we can go and that we don't have to be trapped by all of that. And even if it only takes a reminder of someone like yourself for us to remind us that, hey, you don't have to get bogged down in this particular mode of doing things. There are other alternatives and other ways to go, and these can be so dynamic and so creative. And that all of the people who are telling you that, nope, this has all been closed off, can't be done, we're the experts, trust us, and we have things completely under control. Meanwhile, while everything is literally collapsing all around us at the same time.
It's a mark of the sacred that we should be suspicious of, right? The sign of the sacred. Trust us, we've got it all figured out, and they keep us in fear. But I think you're right. And I think what I'm saying is, imagine if we could cure cancer. Imagine we figure that out, and that enough folks get a hold of it that, people who want to be Luddites and keep that out, they get overwhelmed, and the public sees cancer as something that's being solved like scurvy. What does that do to the tension between Black Lives Matter protesters and All Lives Matter protesters? I see the connection there. I think it eases the tension, because I think we're all angry. We see grandma getting sick. We see some people getting sick. We see the death anxiety, and it's entrenching itself. And so if we said something like cancer, gone, what does that do for the hope of people? That they can say, you know what, I feel a little better. Maybe it's the 1980s again. You know what I mean? It's not as hot.
But here, I think that all of that's true, and that we if we are creative and wise, and have real belief in our own agency and power to change the world and to make these discoveries, that these things will happen. But here's the rub on the Girardian rub on what will be the fly in the ointment of all of that liberation that ultimately takes place, is that, if we don't find ourselves transformed by a pattern of ultimately divine transcendence, then if we don't have even our objects to be busied with and working on, then we're just going to get the conflicts are going to get even more comical and hysterical than they are today. And it's hard to imagine how much more comical and hysterical and petty they could possibly get. So again, I think it really comes down to again, the fullness of what's been bequeathed to us, even while at the same time acknowledging that, yes, and in order for things to go well, we do need to make progress in all of these concrete areas that are going to be really great for a lot of people, and to alleviate so much unnecessary misery, which is just obviously the Christian thing to do.
So my final question, the tripart, let me see, here's the thing. Do you believe that mimetic theory is the intellectual answer to challenge and take on the craziness of critical theory? And then I guess a side question to that is, do you see something already emerging in academia that's going to be replacing critical theory that we need to already be thinking about?
Yes.
That could be even totally different and bad or worse in a different way. And then the third question is, we'll just leave those two. Let's go ahead.
Okay. Girard starts off right away by saying that, his theory is a critical theory, in the sense that it's a critical theory in the sense of a hermeneutics of suspicion, of saying, here's the thing that's going on, and here's what's really going on.
Right.
The problem with all of critical theory, the schools of critical theory that have been offered, is that they're all just wrong. So it's a hermeneutics of suspicion, where the suspicion is just simply incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
And Girard's obviously, when you're working with mimetic theory, you're even able to say where specifically and why they're making their mistakes and what they're really actually aiming towards, and how it is that their own structure is being organized and driven. So it definitely is a critical theory. Is there anywhere in academia outside? It's the answer to critical theory. It's the fulfillment of the aspirations of critical theory without all of its insanity. So, truth is real. The mind is capable of at least approaching truth, and you can have rational dialogue. So you don't have all the postmodern digression into just gibberish and nonsense, where words can be just redefined to mean anything, and there is no right answer. It's just structures of power relations competing with each other, and positions of privilege working themselves out. Which is just, when you apply the mimetic approach, you see that no, that's just ordinary. You're just caught in ordinary mimetic rivalry and seeing the whole world through this lens of mimetic rivalry, which you're then reinterpreting or giving interpretation through the whatever critical theory scaffolding you can buttress under it to provide legitimization, even while acknowledging that it is just pseudo legitimization. At the end of the day, there is no objective truth that you can actually aspire towards. But Girard is against all of that, right? He's for science. He's for reason. He's ultimately for God as the guarantor of external reality and our capacity to know and understand and propagate the truth. So, and where critical theory is saying, we need to be on the side of the marginalized, the oppressed, the victimized, but then goes in all of these different hysterical and misguided directions in terms of carving up how it is that actually looks and works. In fact, actually, you have this rich tradition of Christian moral philosophy and theology that can kind of acknowledge the parts that are correct while disarming the parts that are radical, violent, destructive, and corrosive, and to give a critical reading of what's actually doing the driving there and what's going on in a way that I think is comprehensible. Is there anything within the academy that is idea we're coming up, running up against or into Girard? I don't know. I see a lot more interest in Girard generally. I see his name being dropped a lot more recently over the last.
Specifically, I was saying, do you see something coming after critical theory already that's going to be a whole nother ball game that we're going to have to get?
No, I think the whole thing is imploding before our eyes. Okay. I think if you're actually an intellectual, unless you've already got yourself a tenure, a very tenured and very cushy position where you're satisfied with compromising your intellectual and moral integrity on a daily basis, then if you're really an avant-garde thinker, you're not even in the academy right now, because
so
you
this
realize
is the apocalyptic moment of academia.
Yeah, I think so, and like on the hard science end, if you're thinking about like institutionalized academy, so I'm not thinking about anywhere where we're applied, like engineers are fine, and all the applied areas are totally fine, but at just the most theoretical level, where we're running up against the limits of our previous discoveries, and also having to work through whether or not there's huge theoretical assumptions that need to be entirely called into question that would rewrite our whole understanding. And so on that end, I think materialism is playing itself out, right? That they went as far as they could while trying to create this space that keeps God completely out, and creating a whole metaphysics that could expel. I mean, if you look at the metaphysics of the scientific side, just from the point of view of trying to craft a world where God doesn't exist, you can see that might lead to stultifying conditions down the road in terms of the potential for discovery. Now, part of that's really rarefied, and we're touching on kind of the limits of theoretical discovery in one area. Other areas, I think it's just a general stagnation that's gone on. But then in the humanities, it's just a complete dumpster fire. There's absolutely nothing, and you
this
have
is
this
the end. So critical theory and its infection and all of its parallel, post-structuralism is kind of the end of history for academia as we.
Yeah, no. If you were a if you were a postmodern semiotician and you were looking at trying to discover what's the hidden symbolism of it's just this gigantic lived out allegory of the fruition of the ideas that have taken root there, with all of its consequences. And so no, that is just that's a paradigm in the process of collapse. And there's some little leftovers of reason in analytic philosophy, and it's sad, because analytic philosophy was finally, after such a long period of stagnation, actually making some real progress and coming back towards a much more I would just say coming back to the truth. And so there's this little island of reason in philosophy, but everywhere else, the whole thing has just been totally infected with the garbage of political correctness.
So the final question is of that little triple is, imagine that I'm someone who's imbibed deeply into this whole critical theory, you know, a young person of our age, Generation Z, millennial, whatever, and kind of Christian friendly, you know, because I know a lot of these churches are really, in theological circles, are really getting into critical theory and trying to map it into Christianity and all that. But just, so we're not going to say totally hostile to Christianity, just Christian friendly, open to Jesus in some nominal way. And I'm really imbibed in this whole social justice, political correctness, and critical theory. You know, how would you, you know, engage someone?
Well, I'd buy them a copy. I'd buy them a copy of Things Hidden, and maybe supplement it with When These Things Begin, and I mean,
I'm talking about the average, you know, the
no, I really mean
they're in
it.
the
Like,
streets right now, and they're getting
okay. Well,
grandma.
no, I mean,
I'm not saying go up to them in that moment with grandma being attacked. I'm just saying, like, how do you start to make that bridge? Because that's what I want.
I don't really actually know, and you know, certainly there's no within the moment, right? Like, you have to be extremely careful. Like, if you think of Girard on the woman being stoned to death for adultery, and he talks about how, I don't know if it's right or not, but it's certainly a beautiful interpretation, that things are so tense that Jesus has to kind of deflect that aggression by tracing on the sand in the ground, and that the emphasis is, well, that's another point, but that within that moment things are tense, and maybe just a bit of deflection and diffusion is all that you can really do. But if I was actually engaging with someone who was sincere and had an intellectual training in critical theory, then I would encourage them to critically engage with Girard's work and to ask them what they think, and if they have objections, I'd love to hear them and respond to them. The problem is just getting the platform to create the opportunity to actually get critical engagement. And you know, the academy is just so possessed and so anti-Christian. I mean, it's almost like, you know, anything can be true except for Christianity. And if the problem is that Christianity just happens to be true, then we might be in this difficult situation for quite some time. But the problem is just that like you said when we were talking about Kuhnian paradigm shifts, things just keep stacking up. And the fruitfulness of Girard's research and the possibility of actually applying it out into the world is enormous. So eventually it has to get taken note of. And I'm optimistic that in the long run, I don't know how long that will be, but in the long run, that it will finally be appreciated for what it is.
Well, very good. It's been a real fun talking to you, and I think we've covered a lot, and it's exciting to see the different things that are on the horizon. Where can people get a hold of you or stay in touch or look forward to any project or anything?
Yeah, well, first, thank you, David. It's a great pleasure to sit down and to have a discussion. And if people want to get in touch with me, then I haven't posted anything in a long time, but there's my YouTube channel they can go to there. And I think my email address is on my YouTube if they dig there. So I'll let them go on a little hunt to track it down if they're that interested.
Well, very good. Well, we got to stick together as folks out here in the wilderness, because we're not in academia, but you know, it's really important work that we try to help point people towards. So we can...
No, but it's exciting to truly be on the frontier, the real frontier, isn't it?
It is. It is a thrill. It's I guess it's very American, isn't it? Right? Going off to manifest destiny, to parts unknown.
That's right.
Well, take care. I appreciate it.
Great, David. God bless. Thanks.
Took him just a week to make the moon and stars.